Dear Professor Roy Casagranda, it's really an honor to have you back on this channel, and I'm very glad that you found the time to talk to the Varna Peace Institute.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
If I may, I'll introduce you to our audience very briefly. So, for those who didn't watch our first interview, you're a professor of government, a professor of political science at the Community College in Austin, Texas. And you're the founder of the Austin School, which is a lecture series which can be seen on YouTube. And you are an expert not only on the US foreign policy, but also on the MENA region, which is Middle East and Maghreb, basically. Yeah. So before we get to George Floyd and the following protests which are happening now in the US, let's jump right into my first question. Swiss historian Daniele Ganza wrote recently a book called US Empire, The Ruthless World Power. Do you agree with this title of the book, and do you believe that the US is still a dominant world power, and if so, why?
So, I think the title of the book is fantastic. I think it completely captures the reality. The United States is a completely ruthless empire. So, maybe we should start with the term empire, just so that maybe if I explain how I'm defining empire, it'll make the definition make sense. So, at its core, an empire is a state that rules over multiple countries, and then, of course, in the process, probably rules over multiple nations. The United States is imperial, therefore, at every level. So, at its core, it conquered North America from the Native Americans, and in the process, conquered multiple Native American nations and conquered multiple Native American countries. In fact, almost, I don't know if it's because we felt guilty about it or what, but frequently we use Native American country names for the state names. So, for example, Ohio used to refer to the country to the north of the Ohio River. So the state of Ohio is named after a Native American country. Kentucky was the country south of the Ohio River. So we sort of we almost acknowledge what we've done. In addition to that, the United States was created by conquering European-created or European countries. So, for example, New England, the North, the South. We also conquered half of Mexico. The United States owns the northern half of Mexico. And that's just dealing with the 48 states. So even if you dumped Alaska and Hawaii and all the territories, the United States is imperial internally. But then you get Alaska and Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Guam, American Samoa, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and that makes us even externally imperial. But to make things more complicated or worse, the United States has a permanent military presence in about 25 or so states around the world. That includes, of course, Germany and Japan, Egypt, the United Kingdom, Canada. In some of those cases, it's voluntary. So, for example, Canada and the United Kingdom have signed on. This is voluntary. But I'm hesitating because I can't imagine what it would look like if Canada or the United Kingdom were to ask us to leave. Right? Iraq asked us to leave last year. Sorry, it was this year? I don't remember now. Iraq asked us to leave in the last 6 months or so, and we said no, and we're still there. In the case of Japan, Cuba, or Germany, where we have permanent military bases, it's not voluntary. In fact, in Okinawa, the Okinawans, protest our presence at least once a year, and we ignore them. And there's really, literally nothing anybody can do about us. On top of that, we have a temporary military presence, and I'm hesitating there with temporary because temporary could last decades, in probably somewhere between 60 to 90 other states around the world. So that includes the Philippines, although we're leaving. That includes Afghanistan, although we're leaving. That includes Mali, Niger. Like, we're all over the planet, in places you would never expect us to be. The reason I can't give you a firm number is because the United States actually keeps that number secret. I can't tell you all the countries we're in. The way we find out we're in a country militarily is a body comes home. And then we're like, oh, we were in Niger? I didn't know. And that, so we're extremely secretive. We have an extremely secretive foreign policy. And that's really, of course, a product of the last 19 or so years. So one of the things that I've tried to keep track of is all our military adventures. And I just can't do it anymore. I don't actually know what we're doing anymore. Which makes it complicated for me because that's one of the things that I study. So, for example, I could give you kind of a number. I can give you a basic number. So, from 1890, which is probably the moment when we stopped being internally imperial and became externally imperial. From 1890 until somewhere around 2010. So 120-year span of time, the United States participated in approximately 130 military adventures. And I'm coding World War I and World War II as one each, just so we're clear. So in other words, we sent our military, just to give you an example, we invaded Honduras 8 times in that time period. We invaded Nicaragua 7 times. We use the 1890 date as sort of an arbitrary date. You could easily pull this back all the way to when we fought the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean under Thomas Jefferson. But the 1890 point marks the point when the United States became extremely aggressive. We invaded Buenos Aires in Argentina, and then from there we began successive invasions of especially Latin American states, but also East Asia. We invaded China, we invaded Korea, and all of this before World War I. In other words, we were well on the path towards becoming a major imperial power, even before World War I.
Okay.
So what was that?
A bloody history.
So it's an extremely bloody history. The term Banana Republic, which is a clothing line, which I've always found offensive, comes from the fact that we were so obsessed with the price of bananas that what we would do is we would invade Nicaragua or we would invade Honduras with the Marine Corps simply because they had changed the price of bananas. And then we would install a brand new government after we toppled the previous government. And then they would of course, put the price of bananas where we wanted them. I mean, bananas. And, the last time that we did a Banana Republic event was 1954, when we overthrew Guatemala's democracy. And
Operation PB success.
What was that?
The Operation PB success.
Yeah, exactly. And we overthrew the government, which was led by Arbenz. And we triggered a 25-year long, a little bit more than 25-year-long civil war in the process, which may have killed as many as 250,000 Guatemalans. And it was literally for bananas. The company was called United Fruit. And they changed their name now, and they're Chiquitas. So if you ever eat a Chiquita banana, you need to know it's blood-soaked, which is great because blood is full of nitrogen, and it really makes the soil fertile. And of course, our acquisition of Hawaii was done by a businessman named Samuel B. Dole. And of course, it is entirely possible that at some point in your life you've eaten Dole pineapples. And of course, in more recent times, we've done really big, large-scale wars, like, for example, our war in Vietnam and, of course, our war in Afghanistan and our war in Iraq. And in those cases, the death tolls that we've inflicted are much greater. So even though, obviously, invading Honduras 8 times was probably a crime against humanity, the death toll that we were inflicting on Honduras was limited to thousands of people. In more recent times, the type of colonialism that we've done has literally killed millions of people. So over the course of the last 130 or so years, the United States has probably been indirectly responsible for the death of some 20 million people in pursuit of our foreign policy agenda, which is the exploitation of resources from third world countries primarily. And then we've probably directly killed somewhere close to 10 million people. So the idea that the United States is a good country is clearly wrong. I mean, we are a violent and ruthless empire. Right? Probably only Nazi Germany is responsible for more deaths in that time period than we are.
To be clear, it's not that bad people are governing, or that just for fun the US is invading all these countries. I believe, and I believe you agree with my statement, it is for resources, for geostrategic aspects, and it's happening because of a reason. For example, in 55, or in the period where Abdel Nasser was president of Egypt, there was this Suez crisis. So the Suez was a geostrategic important point for oil and so on and so forth. And you talked in your lectures about the US helping the Souths to came in power. So basically it's like it's the same with Iraq. It's like construct European invention, so to speak, or American invention. The modern state I'm referring to, and so this is happening because of oil, like you said with the United Fruit Company, because of fruits, because of diamonds in Africa, and so on and so forth. Do you agree?
So I don't agree that they're not evil. I think this is the definition of evil. If I take from you something and I don't pay you for it, and I kill your family in the process, that's pretty evil. So there's no doubt that this is about resources. The United States, its very birth, its very essence is capitalist. And so, you know, the funny coincidence, of course, is the revolution starts in 1775. We declare our independence in 1776, and Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And I think we've always sort of put it in our minds that we were born and capitalism was born. Boom. So, yes, our goal is always resources. It's not necessarily, that we have other motivations. However, I also think we do have other motivations. For example, it's not like we're invading Australia and New Zealand and stealing their resources. It's not like we've recently done an expedition against France or Germany. We very clearly have targeted brown and black countries. There is also a massive racist element to this. If you look at U.S. foreign policy, prior to our acquisition of the Philippines, so before 1898, we were very much focused on Latin America. And then once we captured the Philippines, we still did Latin America. We didn't stop invading Latin America, but we began now to invade East Asia. And so the United States sort of created an empire in Latin America and East Asia. When Reagan became president, he became obsessed with the Middle East. And he especially became obsessed with Libya and Gaddafi. And really, really went after Libya. It was to the point where he even bombed Libya. And in the process, if you look at the death toll of American soldiers, so right, because you can use that kind of as a way to measure where we were putting the emphasis, it was almost entirely in Latin America or East Asia. Once Reagan became president, there have been almost no deaths of U.S. soldiers anywhere but the Middle East. And so there's been this massive shift. Now, obviously, you can point to oil as the reason to go into the Middle East. But there's a really weird thing about that. And the weird thing is there wasn't really an oil problem. It wasn't as if the United States didn't have oil. It wasn't as if this was a resource we were missing. And if you do it from a financial standpoint, the amount of money that we spent blowing Iraq up, for example, which was probably about $4 trillion. So the amount of money that we spent blowing up Iraq it pales in comparison to the amount of oil wealth that we stole from Iraq. We probably directly stole somewhere between $60 billion and $120 billion worth of oil. That's a terrible financial transaction. We could have just paid them for the oil and we would have saved trillions of dollars.
Isn't it true that the war is paid by the general public? And
Yes.
and the amount that is to be won or gained through oil, through the sailing of oil, get in the hands of very few people.
Yes, very, very true.
So for those people, for those families, like the Roosevelts and the Bushs and all the other families that are involved, for these families, this is a good business model.
It's a very good business model. Not just because they're going to get access to Iraq's oil at a discounted price, but also because they're very heavily invested in Raytheon and General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin, the weapons industry. Because, right, the American public spent $4 trillion. Where did that $4 trillion go? It went to the weapons industry. And so if you have stocks in the weapons industry, you literally just made $4 trillion. So it's a way to not just plunder Iraq, you're also plundering the United States. So the American public is also victims here, but the American public still benefits because, right, we basically get discounted oil in the process. And we can drive these giant SUVs around that are basically empty. There's no reason to have the SUV. And we can feel good about ourselves. We mow our lawns with tractors. Like, what ridiculous kind of gardening is that? If I would understand it if there was actually a food substance you were getting out of your lawn. But we're getting literally nothing out of the lawn except a fetish for short grass. And we're using a non-renewable resource to do this. It's preposterous, and it's only doable because we're willing to do these kinds of genocidal attacks on places like Iraq.
You said now a very interesting thing. The historian Fernand Braudel wrote in his, I believe it was a trilogy, and each book had about 1,000 sides. And he analyzed the beginnings of the capitalist society in Europe. And he analyzed that the elite tried to involve the normal people into their game, into their business model, so that everything can flourish and so that the interests of the elite become simultaneously the interest of one nation or one society or the public. So this was a very nice coincidence, and I believe it's true now. So if one say it's in the interest of the US America or US American population, or it's the same like it's the interests of big corporations, some elites and so on. Do you agree with this?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I can give you a recent example of this. So we just did a massive bailout because when we went into COVID-19 lockdown, it had a pretty big impact on our economy instantaneously. Let me just set this up first. We just ended 11 years of nonstop economic growth. That is the longest period in U.S. history of continuous economic growth. Within days, not weeks, not months, not years, within days of ending that period of nonstop economic growth that lasted more than a decade, our corporations were on their backs dying. So that tells me that our entire corporate structure is completely fragile and is held up by toothpicks. Because how could it possibly be that after 11 years of nonstop economic growth, these corporations can't weather a few days of economic downturn? So our brilliant and illustrious Congress basically passed, I think the final number was $3.7 trillion. I'm hesitating because I've been having a hard time pinning down the exact amount. But it was somewhere around $3.7 trillion worth of bailout, basically. 1 trillion of that was sent in the form of checks to everybody, and also increased unemployment benefits. So if you're getting unemployment, you got a big bump as well. So basically 1 trillion of the 3.7 trillion went to the bottom 99%. And then the remaining 2.7 trillion went to the top 1%, as if somehow the top 1% were poor and needed financial help, even though the top 1% owns 40% of the United States' wealth. So I brought this up in my class, and a student said, but what if we didn't bail them out? It would destroy us. It would destroy the economy. And of course, that's preposterous. That's absurd. But it just shows the extent to which Americans have bought into this idea that the future of the wealthy is the future of everybody else, and that somehow we need them to be wealthy. And in fact, another student jumped in and said, those wealthy people needed to be able to pay their employees. So if we didn't bail them out, who would pay their employees? But at the same time, we've got 23% unemployment. So clearly they're not paying their employees.
And
it's strange linkage.
let's remind our audience that there is this neoliberal theory called trickle-down. So it's the same what you said. So yeah, if the rich are getting richer, the poor is also fine.
That's the belief. That belief has been widespread in the United States for about 40 years. It has never worked. So whenever we've done a tax cut for the rich, because that's the idea. It's a preposterous, ridiculous notion. If you do a tax cut for the rich, it'll stimulate the economy. Whenever we do get a little bit of a temporary bump, and it's like a sugar rush, where like you ate candy, and then it crashes, just like a sugar rush, and we end up actually worse off than we were before we did the tax cut. And that has happened every single time. And yet Americans cleave to this belief as if it was somehow true, which of course is wrong. And the reason, of course, the basic reason is by giving the tax cut to the rich just hoard their wealth. They don't spend it. So you've taken that money out of the economy, and that money would have gone to the government, which would have produced services and goods and would have spent that money in the economy in some way, shape, or form. And so you've just literally taken that money away from the economy as opposed to re-injecting it back in.
I wanted to mention that there is also, like you said, it's not only for resources that the US is invading a lot of countries. It's also because of sphere of influence or pushing back the communists back in the days of the Soviet Union. And there are a lot of strategies and techniques. So let's talk about the different techniques that the US is using to convince their own population that they are the good empire, the good world police, and to legitimize their own wars. So, like we mentioned, there is propaganda, public relations, like we talked before about the United Fruit Company, but there are also some, how can I say it, like conspiracies, because when we mention, when we think of the Tonkin, Tonkin was a conspiracy because it didn't happen. Yeah, it's one example, or the Cuba crisis, where it all can be seen. The documents, the files are now open to the public. So you remember this one document that says that there was a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro, but it was not easy to catch him, so they tried, in German it's called Schweinebucht-Affäre.
Oh, Bay of Pigs.
Yeah,
That's
Bay of Pigs.
Schweinebucht. It took me a moment. It's been 30 years since I lived in Germany.
Yeah.
So these two examples, Tonkin and the Bay of Pigs,
Yeah.
what is it? How can you explain it? So is it a conspiracy?
So there's a problem with the United States being an empire in the sense that it has elections. So it has to somehow convince its public that what it's doing is legitimate. So the United States always seeks a casus belli. So let me give you a really early example. So in 1845, the United States was annexing Texas. And Texas at that point was literally just 9 years old. The Republic of Texas had broken away from Mexico in 1836. And here we are in 1845, just 9 years later, and the United States is annexing Texas. In other words, Sam Houston, the first president of the Republic of Texas, from the beginning, his goal was to take Texas and put it in the United States. When Texas seceded from Mexico, the border was very clearly defined so that the southern border of Texas was the Nueces River. That was not in contention. That was an absolute truth. But when James K. Polk was becoming president, he won the election in 1844, he sent a letter to the president of Texas, who at the time was a man named Anson Jones, and told him, I need you to change the border for Texas from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande. And of course, Anson Jones is, but nobody believes that. Mexico doesn't believe that. Texas doesn't believe that. France doesn't believe that. The United Kingdom doesn't. Nobody believes that. And Polk said, it doesn't matter, just do it. So he does it. So that when Texas is annexed, all of a sudden there's an artificial, manufactured border dispute about where Texas ends. And when you make the border the Rio Grande, it means that Texas not only ends up the Texas that is today, which is bigger than the original Texas that went to the Nueces River, but it also makes it so that Texas would own New Mexico, or not all of it, but most of it, a big chunk of Colorado, a piece of Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Pieces of Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. In other words, Texas would be this massive state, way bigger than any European state except Russia. And it was preposterous. Nobody would believe it except the gullible, easy to manipulate American public. And then Polk could then say, Mexico unlawfully has Texas territory, and so it's within our right. And that's how he triggers the Mexican-American War in 1846. In other words, he created an artificial crisis, and the American public bought it. By the way, it's how Trump rules. He creates artificial crisis after artificial crisis, ramps everybody up, and then at the last minute, he chickens out and he cowers away, and he doesn't fulfill whatever threat he was planning to do, but it gets us in this nice little roller coaster emotionally. So by the time we're doing things like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, so for some of your viewers might not know exactly what happened there. So according to the U.S. military, according to the Navy, North Vietnamese boats, not ships, approached U.S. ships and opened fire with 50 caliber machine guns. So don't get me wrong, I think the 50 caliber is a great weapon. It's just not going to do anything against a United States destroyer. It's not. Maybe it'll scratch the paint a little bit. So it's a really dumb story to begin with. According to us, we responded by firing missiles at their wooden boats. And we blew up their wooden boats. And we said this was an act of war by North Vietnam. Congress then passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and we then used it as an excuse to invade South Vietnam. We did not ask South Vietnam permission, and South Vietnam did not invite us to go to South Vietnam. We literally invaded. We actually landed with landing craft like we did at D-Day. when we were invading Normandy in World War II. And the South Vietnamese were so shocked by the affair that they lined the beaches up with women, and really girls, they were teenage girls and women, dressed in white dresses holding flowers, almost to say, please don't, whatever you're doing, please don't kill us. We now know, because of Freedom of Information Act, that in fact the whole thing was a lie. The North Vietnamese never shot at our ships. Another classic example of this is the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We knew for a fact Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction when we attacked in 2003. And the reason, let me just lay that out so that we're clear, it's not me just talking. What happened was, when we attacked Iraq the first time in 91, George Bush Sr. said, as soon as you get rid of your weapons of mass destruction, we will let you back into the world, basically. We're going to isolate you until then. When the UN weapons inspection regime showed up, Scott Ritter was the inspector on the ground. He was a U.S. Marine. He was a colonel. And by his own acknowledgement, he was a conservative Republican, right? He shows up and he asks the Iraqis, show me where your weapons of mass destruction are. And they said, we don't have any. And he said, no. And he pulled out the receipts. We had the serial numbers. Why? Because we're the ones who supplied them with the weapons of mass destruction. So we actually knew exactly how many missiles they had, how many had sarin gas, how many had mustard gas, how many had VX gas. We had even supplied Iraq with anthrax at one point, and we knew exactly what they had. So we said, we know you're lying because we could show them the receipts. At which point they said, okay, we thought this was hush, hush. We didn't think you wanted the world to know we had your weapons. We blew them up. We blew everything up in August of 1991. So what Scott Ritter then did for the 6.5 years that he was the weapons inspector for the United Nations in Iraq was he went from site to site where the Iraqis either had the capacity to make weapons or where they had blown them up and looked for the serial numbers. And by 1998, he had discovered 98% of the serial numbers. And the shelf life on those chemical weapons was about 7 years, and the last time we made a delivery was, I think, 87. So they were all expired by 94. So who cares if you didn't find the last 2% in 98? In other words, when we go to war in 2003, we know it's a bold-faced lie. What's remarkable to me, though, is that the Bush administration didn't plant evidence. The Bush administration knows that the American public is not only extraordinarily gullible and not only has bought into the whole system, to such a degree they didn't even feel the need. They had so much contempt for the IQ of the American public, for the intelligence of the average American. They didn't even feel the need to go ahead and place weapons of mass destruction to find them. That's a lot of contempt to have for a public. Having said all of this, one of the ways in which the United States has got buy-in, has created buy-in, is through racism. Let me give you an example that probably not many people have really thought about. So at the end of World War II, the United States had a serious problem. World War II solved the problem of overproduction. It's only a problem in a capitalist society. It's actually utopia in a socialist society, right? Your goal is to make it so everybody has something. In a socialist society, in a capitalist society, you have to have scarcity, because without scarcity, a thing won't have the kind of value that you can create massive profits off of. So you literally want somebody to go without in order for somebody to make a lot of money. So World War II, we literally blew everything up, obliterated it. And that's how we got out of the Great Depression. We could have just as easily become socialist, and that would have gotten us out of the Great Depression, but we wanted to hold on to capitalism. Well, we don't want to do World War III. At the end of World War II, we've decided we never want to be, because right now that we're on the top, World War III just threatens that. And the possibility that there's going to be nukes involved, that's probably bad for business. So we need some mechanism to make sure that we don't have another surplus event again that triggered the Great Depression. And so there are lots of solutions: planned obsolescence, perceived obsolescence, subsidies, changing the way people consume. There's lots of solutions. But one of the really important things was for the American producers to have someone to sell to. And we realized at that moment Europe was in such ruin, Europe would never be rich enough to buy our products again. Europe was finished. And so we came up with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was to rebuild Europe's economy, not because we were lovely human beings who cared deeply about the average German or the average French person or the average Italian, but because we believed if we didn't get Europe back on its feet, we wouldn't have customers for our products. It never occurs to anybody, because we're so racist, that we could have done something a little bit different. For example, instead of giving the Marshall Plan to Europe, we could have given it to Africa, or we could have given it to India, or we could have given it to Southeast Asia. Now, you could make the argument that the Dutch owned Indonesia and the French owned Indochina and the British owned India and the British and the French had divided Africa, so why would we give that money to those empires? Okay, we could have given that money to South America and Central America and Mexico. We could have literally created a new system where instead of giving Europe the money, we could have given it to Brazil and Argentina and Mexico and developed their economies. They could have become the consumers of our goods. And then you could invoke the Cold War and say, yeah, but we're going to fight the Soviet Union in this Cold War. We need a military force in Europe. We could have told Argentina and Brazil and Mexico, there's a string attached. You have to help us militarily occupy Europe. In other words, we could have created a regime where we allied ourselves with the brown people to the south of us and turned Europe into the colony that we plundered while we developed North and South America. But it never occurred to us that that was an option because our racism is so deeply embedded in us. Of course we're going to help the white Europeans. Of course we're not going to help the brown Latin Americans. And so at the end of the day, what we've done is we're the great white nation, right? Theodore Roosevelt painted our Navy white and sailed it around the world and called it the Great White Fleet, the Great White Navy, because we were letting the world know that at the end of the day, we might have a large brown and black population, but we are still a white nation. And of course, that we're losing that. That's changing really rapidly. But this is part of the buy-in that Americans have done is they think, oh, we're advancing Western civilization. Oh, we're advancing democracy. Oh, look at what we did to Germany and Japan. They were ruled by tyrants, and now they're these thriving, wonderful democracies, right? And so there's a little bit of we're making the world a better place, and I think that's part of the buy-in.
So to sum up, when we see such things as Colin Powell shows us a little bottle and says, okay, there are weapons of mass destructions. When we see this little girl crying, Naria, I think she was called Naira, whatever. She cried in the U.S. Congress that the Saddam Hussein is like Hitler, destroying babies so that soldiers.
The Kuwaiti woman.
The Kuwaiti princess, I believe.
Princess, you're right, yes.
And it was orchestrated by the public relation agency called Hill and Knowlton. And there are many details and many sad stories, to be quite honest. It's funny in one hand, but it's also very, very sad. And so this little tricks and tactics are working very well.
Very well.
And like Professor Ulrich Brandt from the Austrian Department of Political Science called this the Imperial mode of living. So basically the West is living by exploiting cheap labor, cheap or free resources, getting it from other countries and so on and so forth. And also it's like it's a power structure that is divided along many lines, racism, gender, so there are many lines. So let me move on and let's go to the next question. Do we see with the death of George Floyd a neo-colonial mentality, historical deep-rooted structural racism in the US? So, for example, Lee Edwards, professor of the London School of Economics, wrote an analysis on this topic, and she said, I quote, "White privilege is a root cause of microaggressions that constructs the other on a day-to-day basis. The drip-drip of a leaking tap that continuously inflicts the pain of racism. If racism is to be overcome, then it needs to be dismantled." So, having said that, do you think that first the white man should dismantle his own privilege and we should dismantle the day-by-day racism? And what do you think about what is happening now in the US with the protests and George Floyd? And what's your stand on this?
Okay, so George Floyd, and then you could throw in Eric Garner, and there's a whole litany of names that have come up in recent, Trayvon Martin, that have come up in the last 10 or so years. Tamir Rice is the boy that was shot by the police. Within 3 seconds of the police exiting his car, the policeman shot a boy holding a plastic toy gun. The toy gun had an orange thing on the end indicating that it was a toy gun, right? So like it's layers of, wow, you shot within 3 seconds. Like that didn't even give you time to say, drop the gun. This is a history that traces back to slavery. We were Hitler's inspiration. I mean, think about what we did. We conquered North America. We genocided the native population. We brought in an African population and we enslaved it. And then we built our state on the backs of that African population. Plantations, when you think about it, are nothing other than work labor camps. They're just literally a concentration camp. The reservation was basically a giant open-air concentration camp. We were Hitler's inspiration at every level. In 1901, the great state of Indiana has the wonderful right to be the first government on earth to create an official eugenics program. And that eugenics program was designed to weed out the dumb people. You actually got rated as a moron, an imbecile, or an idiot. You would take an IQ test, and then they would give you one of those 3 classifications if you were particularly dumb. And then each state, because other states then began to adopt Indiana-style laws, as they adopted them, they determined how they would treat you. And then, of course, in Buck v. Bell, the Supreme Court ruling in 1926, the Supreme Court ruled it was legitimate for the states to sterilize you against your will. And by the way, that's still the law in the United States. That has never been overturned. For the record, the last time I am aware of a mass sterilization event, the last states got rid of their eugenics laws in the 1970s. But the last time I'm aware of a mass sterilization event happened between 2006 and 2010. So we're just talking about 10 years ago. And I believe it was about 200 Californian women were forcibly sterilized. The reason I'm bringing this up is because even though this is obviously a class issue, because there's clearly in the United States a relationship between how wealthy your parents are and how well educated you are, there's also very much a race issue in this. That is to say, a lot of people bought into the concept of eugenics with the understanding that we would do something in terms of getting rid of or at least lowering the number of black people in the United States. In other words, at its core, everything that we've done over the last 350 years, even when we were a British colony, has had this understanding that black people are inferior and therefore need to be exploited like you would exploit a horse or a donkey. When we ended slavery, we had a serious problem, and that was how to continue to exploit that black population's labor. And of course, the answer was systematic terrorism. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, was created. It literally murdered black men on a regular basis, hanging them from trees. There was a picnic. People would bring their family. They would bring sandwiches and drinks, and it would be an event you would go to celebrate the murder of some random innocent black men. That ended. The lynching stopped. But what then happened was our police began doing it. Our police force took over the illegal lynching and began murdering innocent black men randomly in place of that, and sustained and maintained the system of terror that had been created by the Ku Klux Klan. In other words, it's now the state that does this, that does the lynching. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about, our police, we estimate, we don't know, because our police are not required to report when they murder somebody, which is fascinating to me. We think that the police murder about 100 people in the United States per month. We think that the police are killing right around 1,200 people per year. What's really remarkable about that is the United States has a very high murder rate. About 12 to 13,000 people per year are murdered in the United States. So the police literally account for somewhere around 9% or so of the total murder rate in the United States, which is remarkable because you would think the police were here to stop it, not create it. To give you an idea of how that fits in terms of terrorism, if you track, we sort of start the history of U.S. terrorism in the mid-1960s because a Vietnam vet, Marine, went to the top of the University of Texas tower and began shooting people with a rifle as they were on the ground. And that sort of starts a reign of terror in the United States that has now gone on for 54 years. If you look at the number of terror attacks in the United States over the last 54 years, they've killed, including 9/11, just so we're clear, they've killed 8 people per month. So our police are literally killing 12 and a half times more people per month than terrorists are. So actually, I propose that we put the terrorists in charge of law enforcement in the United States, because at least we'll get the death toll down. I know that was maybe too much sarcasm, but I felt it was a good idea. The reason I'm bringing all this up is because, to try to answer your question, we're so racist that we actually use the police to execute the racism. Our incarceration rate in the United States is 3% of the adult male population. 3% of the adult male population is on probation, parole, or in prison. That is a higher percentage of incarcerated people than any society has ever achieved in human history. Except, there is an exception, Stalin, at the worst point of the Great Purges, I think he got Russia up to like 3.3%. I'm not an expert on this, so if somebody looks it up, please tell me what the actual number was. I know it was over 3%. So he beat us briefly. He beat us, I want to say it was 1938. It's right around there. He beat us briefly. And the thing, though, that's different between us and the Soviet Union was we've done this for 40 years, not for 1 year. In other words, this is orders of magnitude way worse than what the Soviet Union did in the midst of Stalin's paranoid, tyrannical breakdown. That 3%, if you break it down by race, becomes really shocking. So it's 2.5% of the white male adult population. It's 3.5% of the Hispanic adult male population. It's 8% of the black adult male population. Blacks do not commit crimes at a higher rate than whites. So that's our racist assumption, is that blacks are out there committing more crimes. It is not true. Whites and blacks are just as likely to commit crimes. But blacks endure an incarceration rate greater than 3 times what whites do. There are several reasons for this. Oh, and for the record, by the way, in the United States, there are, as a percentage of the population, whites are more likely to be drug dealers than black people are. So just for the clarification there, because I know everybody's image is that black people are the drug dealers. There are more whites as a percentage of the population. The reason this matters is the police literally target the black population. So first of all, if you're black, racial profiling, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the police are racist. Period. There's no two ways about it. Some of it is implicit bias. Some of it is institution, as opposed to just you sat down and said, I hate that black guy. Some of it is just, this is the knee-jerk reaction. But there's another reason for it. And it actually goes back to trickle-down economics, which we talked about earlier. When the United States went through its irrational period of trickle-down, which we're still doing, by the way, 40 years of it. But when we started doing this under Ronald Reagan, all of a sudden, all these counties and cities and states didn't have any revenue because they had cut their taxes. But the American public is so fundamentally irrational that on the one hand, they wanted their taxes cut, but on the other hand, they wanted all the social services to remain exactly as they were. In other words, they weren't willing to pay for the tax cuts. Well, that meant that if you were a politician in a city council, or you were a politician who was elected to serve in a county government, or you're a politician who's elected to serve in a state government, you had to figure out a way to fill the gap of the tax cut and still provide people with those social services. So here's what we did. We had law enforcement begin ticketing people. So speeding tickets, parking violations, noise violations, whatever we could come up with to generate the taxes that were cut. And in other words, we created a new type of tax system where it was random tax, where you did a minor infraction on some code, and then as a result, now you had to pay a $100 fine, and then that would pay for the tax cut that you and your neighbors got. What happened really early on was the police realized something. A white person was much more likely to successfully defeat that ticket. And the reason was, first, they had better education, because as a general rule, whites are richer than blacks. By the way, in the United States, it's about 14 times. The median white family has about 14 times the wealth of the median black family.
So there is a class dimension as well.
There is a class dimension in our racism that's built into the racism. So the reason money matters is because that's how we fund our public schools. Your school, I'm going to say this because it's so irrational, I might have to say it twice. Your school is funded according to the tax base of its neighborhood. So if you live in a poor neighborhood, your school isn't going to get very much money. If you live in a rich neighborhood, your school is going to get fantastic amounts of money. So, and I'm talking public schools, I'm not talking private schools. The public schools are designed to give the rich a better education and to give our public schools in rich neighborhoods are as good as our private schools. Our public schools in poor neighborhoods are so awful, you might as well not have them. They're basically just daycare centers. So if you're poor black, odds are good you got a terrible education. If you're a poor white, odds are good you got a terrible education. But because the wealth discrepancy goes right down race lines, it meant that if you're a police officer, you know that the black person doesn't have the resources to fight the ticket, but the white person might. The white person might have the education to know they can fight the ticket. The white person might have connections. The white person might have the money to hire an attorney. And so, as a police officer, a white person goes by speeding 10 miles over the speed limit, you might not chase them because it's a waste of your time. And then a black person comes down the road speeding 10 miles over, you go get them and give them a speeding ticket because you're going to get more money back from it. What then ended up happening was all these police departments now began preying on black neighborhoods. And that became a terrible vicious cycle because the blacks were poor to begin with. Now they're being hammered with all these fines, so they become even poorer. I'm going to say another crazy thing, besides the fact that we still have eugenics, that it's still okay to sterilize people in the United States, and the fact that we have a massive incarceration rate. And by the way, 50% of the people in prison committed nonviolent crimes. Why would you ever imprison a person for a nonviolent crime is beyond me. In addition to all of this, so you're racially profiling because you're going to get the money out of the person. We have debtors' prisons. The United States of America in 2020 has debtors' prisons. If you can't pay your fines, you go to prison. This is like 19th century Charles Dickens England. And so what ends up happening is, not only are the police targeting black people, but black people there are the most vulnerable population. They're actually poorer than our Hispanic population. The average Hispanic has almost twice the household wealth as the average black person. And so the system is designed to exploit black labor, to keep black labor in poverty, and to perpetuate this. And we see it ripple throughout. What's remarkable is how resilient black people are. So in this genocidal ethnic cleansing hell that we've created for the black population, the remarkable thing is, if you look at the demographics over the last 60 years, the black population has risen from 12% of the US's population to 13%. In that 60-year period, the white population has dropped from 85% to 60%. So somehow blacks have managed to survive this, physically survive this. Like their victory, their revolution is almost just the simple act of surviving. On top of that, the percentage of black people going to college in the United States was awful for decades. It's slowly catching up with the white population. In fact, I believe in some states it's higher now. As a percentage of the population, the number of blacks going to college is really high now. And blacks participate in the political system unlike any other racial group except whites. Blacks and whites are on par for voter turnout, which you probably know is awful in the United States. We run 50 to 55% voter turnout. At the national level, blacks and whites are running right about 60% voter turnout. So on the one hand, we are an extraordinarily racist society that expressly targets the black population and kills them. I mean, so in 2009, there was an Iranian woman. Her name was, I think I can remember the name. I think it's Neda Agha Sultan. She was murdered during the Green Movement by a sniper on a rooftop. And everybody around the world, I think, noticed her death. It was this big event. Like, here's this beautiful, young, hopeful woman, brilliant woman, and she's shot ruthlessly by this cruel, sadistic state that had a sniper on the roof. That's actually annually happening in the United States. So not only was George Floyd murdered through strangulation by being choked, Eric Garner in New York was also strangled. He was strangled because he was selling cigarettes one at a time on the street corner. I mean, that's obviously not an awful crime. Here in Austin, where I live, last month, no, it was April, so because it's already June. So 2 months ago, there was a young Hispanic man named Mike Ramos who was murdered by the police. He committed nothing that would require that kind of physical force, that kind of physical violence. So the protests in Austin haven't just been about George Floyd. Mike Ramos is also part of the protests that we've been having in Austin. Well, the police have been shooting the protesters. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like, we had a young man. He's 16 years old. His name is Brad Ayala, and Brad Ayala was at the protest, the George Floyd protests. He was separated from the rest of the protesters by a considerable distance on a hill observing. He wasn't directly in the protest. And a sniper on top of the roof shot him. Now, supposedly it's with a non-lethal weapon, and it was a beanbag. The beanbag hit him right here in the head, in the forehead, and of course, that kind of velocity, that beanbag is probably going to cause damage, brain damage, right? The kind of trauma that your brain is fat in a bone casing in liquid, so having that kind of trauma is going to cause brain damage. I have a student whose mother was a medic, and a black man during the protests right here in Austin, so I'm sure this is all over the place, a black man was shot with a rubber bullet, and he went down. And my student's mother ran out to help him. Like, she's literally wearing a medic vest saying that she's a medic. And the sniper shot her too with a rubber bullet. I mean, this is the United States. This is the world we live in, where we're regularly being treated the way the Islamic Republic of Iran treats its population. But there's a twist to all of this. And the twist is just utterly painful. Some of you might have noticed on the news last month that men, mostly men, some women, carrying assault rifles, stormed the Michigan State Capitol. And when they did this, the Michigan State Legislature had to flee because there's a bunch of people in the Capitol with assault rifles, walking around with assault rifles. There was nothing done about that. Now, the claim was we have a First Amendment right to freedom of assembly, a First Amendment right to freedom of speech, and a Second Amendment right to bear arms. Great. But then as soon as people show up to protest the murder of a black man, the unnecessary, cruel, sadistic murder of a black man, and they're peacefully demonstrating, thousands of police, the National Guard, show up carrying assault rifles. Like, for peaceful demonstration against police violence. And what do the police do? They begin shooting people with rubber bullets and beanbags. The irony is insane. It's impossible to look at this and think that we are anything other than an extraordinarily violent racist society.
This reminds me of a case in Austria. We had this 25-year-old asylum seeker called Marcos Umofuma, and he was deported from Austria to Bulgaria, and on the way from Austria to Bulgaria, 3 police officers killed him, and it was a showcase of police brutality. They fettered him, they gagged him, they taped his mouth so he couldn't breathe, and he died painfully during the 1-hour flight. And it was also a very sad and racist story of the Austrian police.
I mean,
not only the US, but yeah.
So I'm totally there. I recognize that the racism is pandemic, right? It's the whole planet, and it's endemic. It's never going away. And for sure, there's plenty of racism in Europe. I think the difference is the scale of it. That in the United States, the systematic murder of black men is just so high, and even of Hispanic men. Like, if you have a child and that child is brown or black, you cannot help but be worried about the day-to-day existence of that child. And, again, because the police don't reveal their numbers. There are some police departments who feel like it's necessary to reveal their numbers, and they do. That's why we have any data whatsoever. But because the police are killing 100 people a month and we don't know the circumstances of that, and because every once in a while somebody happens to have a camera there at that moment, Because think of all the times that there was no camera there at that moment. There was, because of all of this, we kind of have an idea that some of that 100 people per month is probably this kind of racial targeting. That there's a significant number of people who are just systematically murdered, and that we don't even hear of. So it's the rare case, I think, that comes to the surface. Here in Texas, a couple of years ago, a police officer, a white woman police officer, entered the home of a black man and shot and murdered him. I mean, this is the level at which this is operating.
And also to remind our audience that there is this class dimension, and black people not as much represented, for example, in hierarchy. If you okay, Obama is maybe one exception, but in politics, but also in the military. So high-ranked generals or officers are not black statistically.
That's actually very true especially for officers, and that's because the way officers are recruited is a class-based system, right? We expect you to have a college degree before you can become an officer, and probably the majority of the black population that enters the military is doing it because they're poor, and this is a way to get a job. And so as a result of the fact that they were poor, they were less likely to have gone to college. The other part about less representation in government, I actually want to push back on that a little bit, because this is a point at which we can get a little bit of a celebration. So if you break down the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives racially, the Senate is a very white institution. There are 91 whites. The white population completely dominates the Senate. White people like myself are 60% of the population, but we're 91% of the senators. But if you look at the House, the numbers change pretty dramatically. Whites are still overrepresented in the United States House of Representatives. We probably have about 120-something% of what we should have. African Americans, however, have about 72% of the representation that they should have, and that puts them in a firm second place for the kind of for racial representation. The Hispanic population in the United States is about 50% of the representation it ought to have. Native Americans are also doing great, but considering they're 1.3% of the population, it almost doesn't matter. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because black people have proven their resilience to such a wild degree that they have managed to find themselves in positions of power, despite the systematic terrorism that they're subject to.
I'm very glad that we both white and more or less privileged persons talk about racism, because Natasha Kelly from Germany said and stated that it's important for white persons to take racism serious and to call it out and to dismantle this structure. And it's not the job of black people to say, oh, wait a minute, there is racism. So I'm very glad that we brought that up, and a big shout out to Natasha Kelly, who wrote a wonderful book of Afro culture, and yeah, she's a wonderful person, so yeah, shout out to her. And if we move on now, there is a big difference integrating, for example, poor people or black people in this hierarchical structure. One have to be very careful. For example, Professor Nancy Fraser analyzed it very interesting. She said that there is a progressive neoliberalism developed in the United States over the last 3 decades and was ratified with Bill Clinton's election in '92. And Clinton was the principal engineer and standard bearer of the New Democrats, equivalent to Tony Blair's New Labour, and in place of the New Deal coalition, he installed a movement, so to speak, a new alliance of entrepreneurs, suburbanities, new social movements, and it's all like a progressive movement calling for diversity, multiculturalism, women's rights, and we can see this also in the politics of Hillary Clinton. It's this okay, let's include everybody, but under our circumstances, you know. So one have to be careful on our terms. Yes. So one have to be careful to separate these two: this progressive or seemingly progressive neoliberalism on the one hand, and a progressive leftist politics or leftist ideology. So these two had to be separated, I believe.
I totally agree. So as a leftist and not a neoliberal, I'm going to critique it from the outside. So one of the ways this manifests itself in the circles where I roam, which is that there are white liberals. So white liberals tend to be, as a general rule, very condescending. They know everything there is to know. And as a result, they talk down to the population of people who are attempting to push back against the system. And it's a constant struggle that I have trying to communicate with that population of white liberals that they're actually still being very racist. The way it manifests itself is that the white liberal population in the United States is desperately trying to maintain white privilege while at the same time giving cookies, giving little crumbs. So the classic example is that Harvard University, for example, goes out of its way to get, the occasional poor black student. And so that poor black student, of course, is going to thrive and do great and prosper, and they're going to leave. And then all the white liberals are patting themselves on the shoulders going, yay, look what we've done for that one person, while essentially leaving the entire structure in place. The way white privilege manifests itself is, so if there's a nearby district to mine, Lake Travis. Oh, actually, let me do Westlake. Westlake's even closer and even better. Westlake is not part of the rest of Austin, and it's separated on purpose by the rich white people who live there, so that they don't have to share their tax base with the rest of the city. So it's like a white upper middle class, upper class enclave carved out of Austin. And then the rest of us are sort of, rich and poor, sort of in the same mix together. If you were from the poor school, the worst school in the Austin area, which is Eastside Memorial, or if you were from Westlake High School, the advantages of going to the better school are so extraordinary that even a subpar person, like a not very smart person, a person with little creativity and little talent, is much more likely to end up in an Ivy League school than a brilliant black person coming out of Eastside Memorial. And that, in other words, we have a myth of merit, we have a myth that there's a meritocracy in the United States that's perpetuated by these white neoliberals, like the Clintons, that if you just work hard and if you're just talented enough and you can overcome all these adversities and you will thrive. But the reality is we put all these massive barriers in the way. And what that does is it advantages the mediocre white children over the extraordinary black and brown children. By the way, it also advantages the male population over the female population, so that it's not just a function of racism, it's also a function of really deep-seated misogyny in the United States. This is a culture that I think at the end of the day actually really hates women. It sees women as a group of people to be exploited. And so if you were a black woman who would have made the best brain surgeon the world had ever seen, but you were from Eastside Memorial, since you're probably never going to even become an MD, there's going to be a mediocre white male from Westlake who's going to get that position. And the harm it does to the community is she would have really healed people, whereas He's not. And I think that the irony is people don't recognize that this white privilege, this white male privilege that we've heaped on a segment of the population actually disadvantages everybody. It's actually harmful for the entire society. And you can see it in the political system. As a general rule, the women in the United States who rise to political power, the black people, the Hispanics, the Asians, are all remarkable and they're all really talented people. The white men who get to the top are morons. I mean, the United States is ruled by a whole class of white male privileged morons. And the policies that they generate are completely insane. This wasn't always the case. Like if you looked at the United States in the 1950s, it is pretty clear that there was a class of talented white men who were ruling us. They might have been racist and sexist and evil, but they at least were smart. Now we're ruled by sexist, racist, dumb men. And so, in other words, the United States has become the beacon for why you shouldn't privilege one group of people over another, because the consequences are so severe. I mean, you can just look at how we've responded to COVID-19. We might as well not have a federal government. Our response is so horrible and so inadequate. We still don't have contact tracing in the United States. How can you battle a disease that's transmitted from one person to the other if you're not tracing who's gotten it so you can isolate them and everybody they've had contact with? In other words, we might as well just have let this thing, not even done the lockdown, and let this thing go for herd immunity. And so there are serious consequences that we're having to grapple with.
Let's stick with US politics, and we spoke to each other months ago and many times before, and I got the impression that you got high hopes on the election and so on and so forth, and now you seem to be a little bit disappointed. What's your stand on the U.S. elections and current U.S. politics?
So I'm embarrassed. Let me just start by saying I'm embarrassed, and the reason I'm embarrassed is because for a brief moment in February, and I texted you because I just needed to connect with you at that moment, because I thought there was a path for Bernie to win the nomination, that Bernie Sanders had a chance, and the reason I'm embarrassed is because I can't believe I was so foolish that I believed that he would be allowed to win the primaries. Like, you would think by now I would be cynical enough to know not to ever have hope. If you were paying attention closely to the primaries, it looked like Bernie was going to win, and all of a sudden, it was like somebody hit a light switch. It was Biden. I want to say the whole turnaround maybe took 3 days. And here's what happened. So the U.S. primary, and this is a perfect example of how badly we're manipulated, really did have a person. I really firmly believe that if Bernie Sanders got into office, he would make the reforms. Like, I believe he is a sincere actor. There aren't many of those in American politics. We actually had a person whom I think would have been we had 2 other people who probably would have also held themselves to a pretty high standard, and they were Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren. Now, when I said Kamala Harris, that's going to freak some people out, and you're going to say, wait a minute, when she was Attorney General in California, she was pretty ruthless. Yes, yeah, she's a deeply flawed person. But if you looked at the campaign, go ahead.
Sorry, continue.
If you looked at her campaign and Elizabeth Warren's campaign, I think Elizabeth Warren also had some serious flaws as well. They were pretty amazing. Like, if you compared either of those 2 women to any politician the United States has had over the course of the last 100 years, I think you did it objectively, you would have to conclude that either of those 2 women would have outshined any of the previous presidents we had had. Like, maybe Jimmy Carter would be the exception. Now, don't get me wrong, Jimmy Carter is also very deeply flawed. So I'm not saying that Jimmy Carter would have been better than Elizabeth Warren or better than Kamala Harris, but he's probably on par. And maybe Barack Obama, right? The reason I'm pointing this out is that the American public did not respond to either of those two women. The American public responded to Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and Pete Buttigieg. Warren actually got 4th place, and Kamala Harris was way down. Like, she quit the race early on, relatively. The fact that Americans were attracted to Pete Buttigieg blew my mind. He is a nobody who was the leader of a tiny town, who did nothing interesting. He made no major reforms. South Bend, Indiana turned around economically, and that's the thing he kept saying, we've turned the city around economically, in a period of time when we had 11 years of uninterrupted economic growth. In other words, you could have probably had no mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and they probably would have turned around economically. So here he was, this 38-year-old nobody, not particularly charming, not particularly interesting, not particularly intelligent, definitely not progressive. He was pretty far to the right, who had somehow eclipsed Elizabeth Warren, who was this diehard policy wonk, brilliant woman who politically was a little iffy, but nonetheless, orders of magnitude better than Pete Buttigieg. And that shows you the lack of intelligence and judgment on the American public's part. Like, I used to be a really strong advocate of democracy. I used to really believe that democracy was the way forward for humanity, that was our liberation. And I still believe that's probably true for maybe New Zealand and Austria and Sweden and Iceland, right? But the vast majority of, certainly not the United States, we're incapable of it. On the other end is Joe Biden. So Joe Biden shouts at people. He calls people fat. He shuts people down. He doesn't know where he is. He at one point announced he was running for Senate instead of president. The guy clearly has some form of senility. I hate to say it. Bernie Sanders is 1 year older than Joe Biden, but acts like he's 20 years younger than Joe Biden. Like, it's a mess. And that's the guy we picked. We picked the literally the worst candidate available. And by the way, that's what we did in 2016. The Democrats picked Hillary Clinton. And for the record, so did the Republicans. Trump was literally their worst candidate. So what we've done is we've created these unpopularity contests. And we now have this crazy situation where we are picking the worst possible politicians to run for office instead of going for the best.
Yeah, and it's a pity because I always watch the Joe Rogan Experience, the podcast, and he invited not only Bernie Sanders, with whom he talked more than 1 hour, which is unusual because the U.S. press do not allow Bernie to talk more than 3 minutes, but also he invited a very important figure of the left, Tulsi Gabbard, and it's a pity that she never got a chance to get in the race. And like we mentioned before, I believe I'm not an expert on US politics, but I believe it's the fight of two Lager, we call it in German, two big how can I say blocks. Yes, one block is this progressive neoliberal bloc that is like Hillary Clinton, Obama, and this group of people who seemingly serve their interests of the big corporations. It's not a secret. And on the other hand, you have this rebellion, so to speak. In one form, it's a revolt against this progressive neoliberalism. And it's like, okay, we have to shut down our borders, protectionism, big nation state, and and it's in the face of Trump. Yeah, it's like these two blocks are fighting each other, and it's a pity that the left never got a chance to articulate a politics and a formula to succeed because of these two big blocks, and that's pity.
It's absolutely true, and it's worth pointing out that the conservative bloc, this conservative force, is extremely reactionary. It's extremely misogynistic and extremely racist, extremely xenophobic, and it has all the same formula and tendencies and attitudes that you would have seen in 1920s Germany and 1930s Germany. And so it's really scary, actually, because they are so powerful. I mean, they have the presidency and they have the Supreme Court right now.
Yeah, and there are not much difference. I mean, they are both capitalistic. They are, for free markets, free under our conditions.
Exactly. As long as we're prospering, we love it.
Yeah.
As soon as we're not prospering, we're going to hit you with tariffs.
Yeah.
Let's start a trade war with China.
Yeah, that's true. So let's move on and to my last question. What do you believe, what do you think is the difference, if there is any difference at all, between the Trump Middle East policy and the Obama Middle East policy? When you compare these two eras and periods of time, what do you think is there any difference at all? What do you think?
There is definitely a difference. First of all, I don't know what Trump's Middle East policy is. He himself is completely incoherent, and he completely changes what he's doing from moment to moment. So 1 minute we're going to go to war with Iran, the next minute we're not. 1 minute we're going to go to war with Syria, the next minute we're not. 1 minute we're going to pull out of Iraq, the next minute we're not. Like, we don't know what Trump's Middle East policy is. Obama's Middle East policy is easier to articulate. So he started off in a really interesting way, right? He went to Egypt and he gave that speech where he talked about, this new way forward, and a lot of Egyptians were thinking, who is this guy? Maybe he's the real thing. Maybe he's really going to help us. So when Obama became president, we were effectively bombing four Muslim countries, because one of the countries that we were bombing was Pakistan. And many people don't including myself, don't include Pakistan as Middle East. It's South Asia. But we were bombing 4 Muslim states. By the time Obama got to the high point in his administration, which was while Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, we were bombing 7 Muslim states, including Libya, which we completely destabilized and broke. By broke, I mean we broke the state. There is no functioning Libyan state now. So say what you will about Muammar Gaddafi, he was crazy, he was terrible, he was a tyrant. It's probably almost always better for the average person to have a functioning state, even if that state is evil, than it is to have no functioning state. The chaos that Libya has gone through since the destruction of the Libyan state, so what are we talking about now? 8 years of mind-numbing chaos is really terrible. So in other words, Obama and Hillary Clinton probably should be tried for something there. They committed some form of crime against the Libyan people by participating in this. Obama also, without invitation, unilaterally invaded Syria. We are an unlawful military occupation force in Syria, like we are in Iraq. So Obama was very interventionist. He was particularly violent. Now you can make the argument that, well, we had to defeat ISIL, which, okay, cool. But we wouldn't have had ISIL to begin with if we hadn't blown up Iraq under George Bush Sr. So, that's like another one of these U.S. self-inflicted, we created the crisis and now we're here to solve the crisis we created. And in the process, we'll create a whole new crisis. And then we can maybe solve that one too. And I think that's become U.S. foreign policy. We're the guys starting the fires, and then we pretend to put them out by throwing gasoline on them. Trump, fortunately for us, for the world, because he's so incoherent, just simply hasn't created the kind of violence that was created under Obama. or created under George Bush Jr. or George Bush Sr. for that matter, or Bill Clinton. It's important to remember that the sanctions Bill Clinton imposed on Iraq killed 800,000 Iraqis through starvation and lack of medicine. And so even though he was only occasionally bombing Iraq over the course of his 8 years, he definitely committed a crime against humanity, especially when you consider how many of those people killed, those 800,000 were children. 500,000 of the 800,000 people who died during Clinton's administration in Iraq were age 5 and under. We literally murdered 500,000 babies. Trump, with all his incoherence and craziness, hasn't done any of that. He hasn't started a new war. He hasn't killed hundreds of thousands or millions of people. He has taken us to the brink of war multiple times, and every time, right, you freeze and you're like, and then he runs away like a chicken. And I gotta tell you, I'm thrilled about that. He's basically destroyed the American empire. He's done what the Japanese couldn't do in World War II, and what the Chinese and the Russians have been trying to do for decades in 4 years, well, 3 years now. And there's a part of me that's really quite happy about it. As long as we're not killing foreigners, it's a good day, even though we're still killing ourselves. Because I kind of feel like if you're killing yourself, well, it's not great. But isn't it better than killing foreigners? During the Obama administration, right, we were doing drone attacks in the Middle East. And at one point, we killed a U.S. citizen in Yemen. We killed 2. We killed a father, and then we came back and we killed his son. And the son was 16. And the American public asked the question, is it legitimate for us to murder Americans overseas? Well, the way we did it was we brought a drone in and we fired a rocket into the cafe where the son was. Well, we didn't just kill the son at that point. We killed all the Yemenis who happened to be sitting there in the cafe drinking tea. And it never occurred to the American public to ask the question, actually, the only person we probably had the right to kill was the son. Because he was an American citizen, what gives us the right to murder those Yemenis that happened to be sitting next to him? And I think that kind of really weird disconnect that Americans have from the rest of the world that Trump embodies has actually somehow put us into a position where we have a foreign policy now that I think is better than the violent foreign policy of the last few decades.
But is there, could we see a continuation from the Trump administration in regard to the Obama administration, when we see that, for example, both Obama and Trump threatens Iran either to nuke them or to go to war with Iran?
Yes.
So this is one point. And the second is, can we see also big support for Israel? Not only weapons, technology, money that is going to Israel, but also when we see Trump declared Jerusalem the capital, and so on and so forth. So I believe.
Go ahead.
We can. No, I believe we can see a continuous line.
Except that Trump represents a serious break, actually. So, for example, Obama himself recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, but the federal government never did. So it was the president personally doing that. Previous presidents had done that as well, but it had never been the federal government. What Trump did was he made it now the official federal government by moving in other words, what happened was, I want to say it was Reagan who started this, but don't quote me on that. I might have this wrong. I believe under the Reagan administration, we recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, but then we postponed it. And so what would happen was every year Congress would postpone the movement to the capital. Trump ended the postponing because we knew it was problematic, and we knew that it would probably eliminate any possibility of a peaceful settlement, or at least a two-state peaceful settlement. And so we didn't do it. For another example of this, Taiwan. We don't recognize Taiwan as separate from China, but we treat it as if it's separate from China. So we treat it like they're two different states, but we pretend there's only one state. Well, when Trump was elected president, the Taiwanese president called him up on the phone to congratulate him. He answered the phone. He's the first president since the enactment of that policy to answer the phone. And it was a serious breach in U.S. foreign policy. And it is in part one of the reasons why our relationship with China is so bad right now. In the case of, you said, Iran. Barack Obama actually had an objective with Iran. And that was to force Iran to sign the Iran nuclear deal. That deal is probably one of the best treaties the United States has ever created. It really is a shining beacon of the Obama administration. I'm blown away that John Kerry pulled it off. I'm blown away that we managed to get the international community on board, that Iran was on board. Like, it was a really amazing thing. And so, yes, you're right. Obama totally put sanctions on. He threatened war with Iran. We were attacked. We were doing cyber attacks in Iran. We were assassinating Iranian scientists. Obama was unkind to Iran, but there was a policy objective at the end. Whereas with Trump, it's completely incoherent gibberish. Right? He keeps saying that the JCPOA, this one of the best treaties the United States has ever created, is one of the worst treaties the United States has ever created, which is absurd. Any objective analysis would reveal that he's an idiot. So the crazy thing is on the one hand, yes, there is some continuity in terms of the threat of violence, but the lack of violence is very different. Having said that, I don't want anybody walking away thinking I'm celebrating Trump too much. There is a big risk with Trump, and the big risk is that we're going to have World War III. He has completely destabilized the world order, and because he's so random, and because he changes directions so quickly, it is entirely possible that he will accidentally trigger World War III. And I think that is a very, very, very high probability. We're now 2 minutes to midnight, right? The scientific community that keeps track of this has us closer to midnight than we've ever been in since the first atomic bomb went off. So he's very, very dangerous on the grand scale, even if he's not quite as violent at the low level. And the fact that we've surrendered in Afghanistan, I applaud him. I think he wanted to surrender in New York City or at Camp David right around the anniversary of 9/11. I think that's remarkable maybe they could have had an upside down flag too while they were at it. The guy has no sense. But I think our surrender to Afghanistan was necessary for us to move forward. And so it's great, even if it's coming from a person who's clearly an idiot, which is really painful.
Yeah.
So I thank you, dear Professor Roy Casagranda, for this beautiful and wonderful talk. We got a good insight of U.S. politics, and I'm very grateful that you found the time to talk to me and to the One Peace Institute.
I love talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Before you let me go, though, I want to do a shout out to Austria, because apparently 50,000 Austrians were marching in the streets yesterday in support of our protests here in the United States. And I'm sure there are protests elsewhere, but I know about that one. So I just wanted to put that plug in and say thank you. We appreciate it.
Great, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully we see each other again.
Soon, I hope.
Soon, yeah.